work that, oh,
All right.
I guess we're,
Sorry about that.
sorry, we're recording now. So I'll be presenting work that they each have done, and then also work that we've done in collaboration to sort of build a story about bird-friendly coffee. All right. So to give a little outline, we're going to start with backgrounding about coffee and bird-friendly coffee. And then we'll cover the results from 3 studies, one that was spearheaded by Ruth, one that was spearheaded by Jonathan, and one that was spearheaded by myself in collaboration with them. And we're going to sort of be moving from the local scale, looking at tree species in coffee farms, all the way up out to the landscape scale. And so that's sort of how we're going to proceed. And we're going to look at impacts on bird diversity, both taxonomic and functional diversity, which I will talk about later. So let's get into some background. Most of you are probably aware of this very sad study that was published in 2019 from Cornell that documented 2.9 billion birds lost between 1970 and 2010, just in the US and Canada alone. Of those birds, 2.5 billion are migratory, many of whom overwinter in Central and South America, which are areas that are also major producers of coffee. The coffee growing regions of Central and South America often overlap with biodiversity hotspots, and they are rapidly losing biodiversity due to tree cover loss, which is in part driven by the expansion and intensification of coffee farms. Besides birds that we see in the summer migrating down there in the winter, or I should say our winter, how are we connected to this issue? Well, coffee is an important part of many Americans' daily lives. As a grad student, I can personally attest to the fact that coffee fueled this entire presentation, as well as most of my dissertation. But you don't have to take my word for it. The stats speak for themselves. So overall, coffee consumption is up by 5% across the nation since 2015. 7 in 10 Americans drink coffee every week, and 62% drink coffee every day. The average American coffee drinker drinks just over 3 cups per day. So the good news is that over half of coffee drinkers report wanting to buy coffee that is certified good for the environment and good for coffee farms and farming communities. So enter the bird-friendly coffee program. Bird-friendly as a certification generally is a program established by Smithsonian in 2000 to conserve birds and biodiversity in coffee and more recently in cacao farming landscapes. The program features a third-party verified certification program that certifies shade coffee farms that meet their requirements, which I will discuss later. The certification aims to increase shade tree species diversity on coffee farms in order to support bird diversity. Their research arm works to validate and improve the program requirements over time, and their outreach arm works to reach growers, consumers, and industry folks to promote bird-friendly practices and products. So many of you are probably wondering what qualifies a coffee farm as bird-friendly, and we'll get to that. But before we do, let's clear up some terminology. People have probably seen shade coffee or shade grown coffee as labels in the grocery store. And this type of coffee is often billed or advertised as being more sustainable or better for birds than the alternative of sun-grown coffee. So sun-grown coffee refers to a farm where coffee is grown with coffee alone, which is represented by the bottom layer of this graphic on the left. Shade grown refers to coffee plants grown amidst other trees, what we'll be calling, quote, shade trees through this presentation. But as you see here, the shade grown moniker refers to a whole variety of types of shade grown systems, from farms with only 1 or 2 potentially non-native trees grown above the coffee, all the way to rustic coffee, where the coffee plants are planted amongst native forest. So these systems can vary widely in the amount and diversity of shade present, and this has implications for birds and biodiversity generally. This is all to say that shade grown as a label is not a very clear descriptor of how your coffee is being grown, which is where the bird-friendly coffee certification comes in. The bird-friendly coffee program has a whole host of requirements listed here for producers in terms of the amount and diversity of shade cover required, as well as other recommendations to producers to enhance biodiversity. These recommendations are based on research that shows that bird diversity, particularly of migratory birds, and biodiversity generally are greater in more diverse coffee farms. So bringing this back to our earlier graphic, this means that only the most diverse shade coffee farms, the top two tiers of this graphic, qualify to be bird-friendly under the Smithsonian certification. So now that we have some of our coffee background, I want to set the stage for the research I'll be talking about tonight. The 3 studies I'll be talking about look at how bird diversity in coffee farms are affected by trees and forest cover, as well as coffee cultivation at different scales. Ruth and her team's work look at the effect of species identity of individual trees within the coffee farm on bird diversity. Jonathan's research in collaboration with Ruth and others at the Migratory Bird Center look at the effects of farm scale and landscape scale forest cover and coffee cultivation on bird taxonomic diversity. And finally, my work in collaboration with Ruth and Jonathan look at the effects of farm and landscape scale forest attributes on another measure of bird diversity known as functional diversity. So we'll start with Ruth's study. So this work was in part motivated by a previous study conducted by Desiree Narango et al. Desiree, as some of you may know, is a biologist at Vermont Center for Eco Studies, a organization which we all love. And Desiree's study indicated that certain coffee shade trees are preferred by foraging birds. She found in Colombian and Nicaraguan coffee farms that insectivorous birds prefer just a few species of shade trees. She also found that non-native shade trees were avoided by foraging birds. But the study had a limited scope for types of birds, tree species, and time period studied. So Ruth and the Smithsonian team designed a follow-up study with the goal of optimizing bird foraging habitat on coffee farms. The study addressed 3 questions. Which shade trees support the greatest bird species richness and foraging activity? Do preferred trees vary among bird guilds? And are non-native trees always avoided? And the team plans to use the results to improve coffee management recommendations and to increase the abundance of preferred foraging trees within coffee farms. So the study took place in Villarrica, Peru, a coffee farming region on the Amazonian slope of the Andes. Most coffee in the region uses shade trees. Some of the region's shade coffee farms use sparse nitrogen-fixing shade trees, like the photo on the left. Some have large, diverse native shade trees, like the photo on the right. So this study was conducted by a local birder and biologist by the name of Benny Osorio. He established 40 sampling points in shade coffee. And at each point, he conducted foraging observations for 3 to 10 individual trees. During an observation period, Benny recorded each species actively foraging, the time they spent foraging, and the general food type. The study ran for 8 seasons between the winter of 2020 and the winter of 2022, but as we all know, there was some major things going on in the world then, so not all seasons were sampled in all years, but they were able to sample for a total of 8 seasons over that period. In total, 25 tree species were included in the analysis with an average of 11 individual trees sampled per species. The data was aggregated across the seasonal periods, and these are the results. Just to orient you to this graph before we dive in, on the x-axis, which is on the bottom, are all the tree species surveyed, while the y-axis shows the bird species richness, or in other words, the number of bird species found associated with each tree. The data on the left in the white are the tree species that supported greater bird species richness than was expected by chance. So in other words, birds preferred these tree species. The species in gray had equal richness to what we would expect by chance, so no preference, but also no aversion. And on the right, the species in red had lower species richness than was expected by chance. So these were the species, the tree species that were avoided by birds. Let's highlight some beneficial tree species first. So Retrophyllum raspiglosi, shown here in the green, is a native conifer listed as vulnerable by the IUCN, but is commonly planted on coffee farms for its timber value. It produces edible fruits and supported a high diversity of foraging birds. Trees in the Inga genus generally supported high bird diversity. These nitrogen-fixing trees are commonly used as coffee shade, and other studies, like the study by Narango et al., have also shown a preference by birds for tree species in this genus. Some downsides, some non-optimal trees. In purple, we have 4 species of genus Cedrella, commonly referred to as Spanish cedars in the mahogany family. These are high-value native hardwood species that are planted for their timber value. Unfortunately, they host low bird diversity, which demonstrates the possibility that new tree planting programs could degrade bird foraging habitat, even if they select native species. They also found some divergent responses to species within the same genus. So they studied 2 species within the genus Ficus, which is the figs, which supported very different bird species richness. So Ficus pertusa on the left supported the greatest bird richness of any tree, but Ficus eximia supported lower than expected bird richness. You'll see a similar difference for 2 species of Cecropias in green. This highlights how, even though we saw a trend of preferences with the species in the Inga genus, trends don't necessarily hold across members of a genus, and so great care should be used before extrapolating results from one tree to a similarly related tree. Finally, in yellow, we're highlighting our non-native species, a eucalyptus on the left and a pine on the right. These are common and increasingly abundant tree species in this landscape, and the team expected both non-native species to support lower than expected richness of foraging birds, in part due to the findings of Narango et al., and in part due to evidence that insects are less likely to be adapted to forage on non-native trees. However, in this context, eucalyptus supported greater than expected diversity, and pine diversity did not differ from chance. So they also looked at the results for species richness within specific foraging guilds. Foraging guild refers to a group of species that have similar diets. So like frugivores eat predominantly fruit, nectarivores consume predominantly nectar, etc. We're not going to look at all the diet guilds for the sake of time and also for the sake of not inundating you with graphs. But we're just going to look at one. To orient you, the black box on the left here, if you can see my cursor, shows the trees preferred by the full bird community. And you'll see when results appear that the diet guild preferences will be highlighted in white. And then note that the tree species axis remains the same as the community level results. So these are the results for invertivores, or birds that feed on insects and arthropods. I'm showing this example because invertivores were the most diverse guild in this landscape, so they're a good example. So we see that Retrophyllum, Inga species, and Ficus pertusa all had significantly higher invertivore richness than the non-native shade trees in yellow. So while this is just one example of a foraging guild, you can see how when we look at individual guilds, the results can differ from when we look at all the birds together as a collective community. However, in general, trees that supported high richness of the full community also supported high species richness within foraging guilds specifically. Okay, getting back to the study questions. What did we find? So question 1 was, which shade trees support the greatest bird species richness and foraging activity? They found that Ficus pertusa, Ingus species, Retrophyllum, Albizia, and Eucalyptus were preferred, while Cedrellas were largely avoided. Do tree species vary among foraging guilds of birds? And the answer is yes. They found that preferred tree species varied among guilds, but in most cases, the trees that were preferred by guilds tended to support high richness and activity by the full community. And 3 are non-native tree species always avoided by foraging birds. And no, they did not find that non-native trees were avoided. Eucalyptus supported a highly diverse foraging community, and pine supported a moderately diverse community. This means that non-native trees are not the biological deserts we might assume they are within this landscape. However, the impact of conversion to these species requires and warrants further study. All right, that was study 1. We're going to zoom out now to the farm and landscape scales to look at how forest cover and sun versus shade-grown coffee cultivation affect the taxonomic and functional diversity of bird communities. Taxonomic diversity simply means species diversity. It's just a fancy scientific way of saying that. There are different measures of it, but in general, when you're counting species, you're measuring taxonomic diversity. We'll get on to what functional diversity is a little bit later when I talk about my results. So in addition to zooming out in scale, we're also going to move north from Peru to Colombia, where Jonathan and my work are based.
Liza, can I interrupt you for a second? I just want to remind folks that if you do have questions, Liza will respond to those at the end of the presentation. And so as we go through the presentation, feel free to write them down in the chat, and then we'll get to them at the end.
Great. Okay, so for the rest of the presentation, we're going to be hanging out in this region. I wish it was hanging out there in real life. This is the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, which is a biodiversity hotspot in the north of Colombia. It is home to 35 endemic bird species, so I can just feel the birders on the call salivating. It's also a region that produces highly desirable coffee due to the unique flavor profiles of the coffee produced there. So a large degree of overlap between ideal for diversity, ideal for coffee. Jonathan, along with Ruth and other collaborators at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, looked at bird species diversity in the coffee growing landscapes within this region. And they investigated how coffee cultivation approach and uncultivated forest cover at different scales, both within and around coffee farms, affected bird diversity. So we're moving from now, instead of looking at shade trees, we're looking at sort of retained uncultivated forest. Okay, so how'd they do this? The team collected data on birds and vegetation from 250 survey locations in both sun and shade coffee farms in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, and they used this data to simulate landscapes and then predict the probability that a species would be present in a given farm within those landscapes. So the reason they simulated landscapes was to allow them to examine how different combinations of different amounts of land under sun or shade coffee, together with different amounts of forest cover at different scales, combine to affect bird diversity. So this visual is derived from Jonathan's paper, and it basically helps you understand how the simulated landscapes exist across a range of coffee farm sizes, a range of landscape level forest cover. So that's the green and white around, the green representing forest cover in the landscape. And then different combinations of coffee type and forest cover within the farm. So in the top, you have sun farms with more sun coffee moving to sun farms with more shade or more uncultivated forest. And then shade farms doing the same thing. And in general, they considered shade coffee to be any farms with greater than 40% coffee cover within the coffee cultivated areas. And sun coffee was anything with less than 20% canopy cover. And then the probability that a given species was present within these landscapes was predicted using what are called community occupancy models. So this is kind of a scary graph, but don't be alarmed, we're gonna walk through it. So these are the results that they presented where the 0 dash line represents the diversity of shade, a farm that is covered in 100% shade coffee. The assumption being, as we've previously discussed, that shade coffee is thought to be, the most diverse, the best for birds. What they are comparing here are both sun and shade coffee farms. The difference between sun and shade coffee farms where forest cover has been retained within the farm to a shade coffee farm where there's no forest cover retained within the farm. What we're seeing here is that in general, setting aside some amount of forest is beneficial and may result in greater bird diversity than shade coffee alone. And that is true even in farms that are using sun coffee cultivation. In fact, for some groups of species like forest specialists, they benefited more from having blocks of forest set aside rather than from shade coffee alone. That being said, the study also found that species relied on shade coffee during the non-breeding season more than the breeding season. So there's multiple things at play here. So taken together, these results suggest that farmers from both sun and shade coffee farms have a role to play in bird species conservation. What does this mean for ecosystem functioning, though? My research in collaboration with Ruth and Jonathan, which we will end with, builds on this study by Jonathan and Ruth by using his data to now look at a measure of diversity called functional diversity that links to ecosystem functioning. So what is functional diversity? Rather than looking at the number of species within a community, which we did before with taxonomic diversity, functional diversity measures the diversity and distribution of what are called functional traits within the community. And these functional traits are so named because they are connected to the ecological functions that an organism performs. Functional traits can be ecological traits, like the foraging guilds we discussed in Ruth's paper, or they can be morphological traits like wing or beak length, which inform things like bird home range sizes or the ability to consume different types of food. And the reason we care about these traits and functional diversity in general, but also in coffee growing landscapes specifically, is that these measures may better reflect the link between biodiversity and healthy ecosystems than looking at species alone. Or put another way, functional diversity may better reflect the implications for biodiversity loss. Additionally, functional traits may better reflect how birds respond to land use change, but in turn tell us something about the functioning and services that the bird community provides. Generally speaking, a more functionally diverse bird community indicates a bird community with a greater capacity to provide services that benefit us as humans, as well as the ecosystem as a whole. So to understand how functional diversity is impacted by the local and landscape scale factors in coffee growing regions, we use the data from Jonathan's simulated coffee landscapes to ask the following questions. 1, how does coffee cultivation system affect functional diversity of the bird community? 2, how does forest cover within the farm affect functional diversity? 3, how does forest cover at the landscape scale affect functional diversity? And finally, how do these factors interact to influence functional diversity of the bird community? So we looked at 3 measures of functional diversity, functional richness, evenness, and redundancy. Functional richness is a measure of the functional trait space occupied by a community. So this terrible clip art representation is an attempt to represent that in a way that's a little more understandable, hopefully. Basically, what we're seeing here is birds with really extreme traits, really kind of out there birds within a community, and they exist at the edge of this quote unquote trait space. Other birds exist at a more intermediate level in the trait space, and they fill the space in between these extreme birds. And functional evenness represents the degree to which the species in the community generally are evenly distributed throughout that trait space. And so ideally for a highly ecologically functioning community, you want a community that's functionally even and functionally rich. Finally, functional redundancy looks at the extent to which traits you have in a community are redundant. If you have a more redundant community, it means that when you lose a suite of traits, because say you've lost a species from the community, you still have other species with similar traits in the mix. The idea being that you hopefully don't lose the functioning provided by those birds that are lost, and so the ecological functions are more resilient overall to change and disturbance. However, a very redundant community may also be a community that is not very diverse. Hence, we picked the 3 measures of richness, evenness, and redundancy as complementary measures to assess both the functional diversity and resilience of the ecosystem in question. Okay, so for the 3 functional diversity measures, we took Jonathan's data on the bird communities and forest cover and coffee cultivation from the simulated landscapes. We combined them with trait data from this new amazing global database on bird traits. So it's a database of the wing length and beak length and everything you could possibly want on every bird or almost every bird in the world. So we took that data together with our data, combined those to calculate the functional diversity metrics. In the interest of time, I'm not going to show all of our metrics. I'll show some of our individual graphs for richness, and then I'll show a bigger combined graph that shows everything together. But let me just orient you a little bit. So the purple is the functional richness of shade coffee farms. The red is the functional richness of sun coffee farms. We analyzed them by season separately because the bird communities, due to the presence of migratory birds, are inherently different. So they're not really, it's apples and oranges a little bit there. And you'll see that here we have forest covering the landscape. So this is looking at the effect of landscape scale forest cover or the forest cover that's surrounding the farm on the functional richness of the bird communities within the farm. This is across all levels of forest cover. This is for averaged across every amount of forest cover within the farm. So what we're seeing is that on average, functional richness peaks at intermediate levels of landscape scale forest cover, and generally functional richness is higher in shade than in sun coffee. Similar but slightly different responses when we look at the farm scale. So shade coffee has generally greater functional richness than sun coffee across all levels of forest cover within the farm. However, at high levels of forest cover, sun coffee and shade coffee start to look very similar, and sun coffee may slightly outpace shade coffee. But again, that would require 87% of the farm being in just uncultivated forest. The other thing to notice is that the greatest gains in functional richness occur when farmers set aside up to 25% as uncultivated forest, and then the returns begin to diminish. So this final figure shows all 3 of our metrics with functional richness on the top, functional evenness in the middle, and functional redundancy on the bottom. The graph shows functional diversity response to forest cover within the farm, and then of farms in different landscape contexts. So the lines in red are farms within highly deforested landscapes with only 10% cover. The farms in yellow are moderately forested landscapes with 50% cover. And the farms in green are 90% forest cover on the landscape, so highly forested landscapes. Just a few things to highlight here. Functional richness responds fairly consistently to increasing forest cover in the farm, regardless of the landscape context. Functional evenness responds wildly inconsistently, and honestly, we don't know what to make of that. And functional redundancy responds negatively to forest cover, both within the farm and at the landscape scale. So what we're seeing is some trade-offs here. When we have low levels of forest, we have high redundancy with limited diversity, meaning that these landscapes may provide fewer functions, but those functions are very resilient and are not likely to be lost from the system. Conversely, under highly forested landscapes, the functions there's potentially greater functioning, but those functions are more vulnerable to loss. So let's come back to our study questions. I'm going to address them sort of collectively. How does coffee cultivation and forest cover at the farm and landscape scales affect bird functional diversity? We see overall that sun coffee is more functionally redundant and less functionally diverse than shade coffee. And landscape scale factors play a big role in influencing bird functional diversity in coffee farms. However, regardless of landscape context, our results suggest that setting aside some amount of forest in the farm can improve functional richness while maintaining high levels of functional evenness, and this does not strongly reduce redundancy. So in general, we're seeing a beneficial effect of setting aside uncultivated forest, and that's consistent with what Jonathan and those authors found looking at species diversity. Okay, so what? We've looked at coffee and forest and birds at different scales, and the question now is like, how do these results incorporate into management or into the bird-friendly program? With respect to the tree level results, the bird-friendly program is using these results to optimize agroforestry design. So specifically, they've published catalogs of shade trees to promote the best species for birds, both in Peru and in Colombia, based on similar work they conducted there. And they've made some catalogs available online in both Spanish and English, and have conducted outreach campaigns to share results with extension agents, tree planters, and coffee farmers. And actually, you can go check those out at shadecoffee.org if you're feeling really excited about shade coffee. And then additionally, and unfortunately, I don't have the stats on what this number is at this point, but some work has been done to incorporate results from Jonathan's study and others to allow farmers with sun-grown coffee that set aside a minimum amount of uncultivated forest within their coffee farms to be part of the bird-friendly certification. So the concept of the benefits of setting aside uncultivated forest has been incorporated into the bird-friendly certification more recently. If you're interested in learning even more about other research from the bird-friendly program at Smithsonian, I'd encourage you to check out their resources online. That top link will link you to all of the studies that they've conducted. And if you're interested in purchasing bird-friendly coffee, they have a tool where you can look up local and online retailers. And I know that quite a few retailers in Vermont do sell bird-friendly coffee locally. With that, I'd love to thank my collaborators, Ruth and Jonathan, who've been an absolute joy to work with, as well as my advisor, Brendan Fisher at the University of Vermont, and all the funders on this project who've made it possible. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for being a great audience and can take any questions.
Again, folks, feel free to put questions in the chat function on here. Liza, I have one quick question. What are the incentives or disincentives for coffee growers to grow shade, have shade-grown coffee?
So I sort of didn't wade into this debate here, but the driving, one of the driving motivators for Jonathan's study is that there's a lot of evidence, despite the fact that in Vermont, where a lot of us are really engaged with our local food systems, and a lot of which are, organic and bird friendly and incorporating wildlife supporting aspects into agricultural spaces. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that for a lot of crops, actually intensifying production and then leaving forest or habitat elsewhere, like larger swaths of habitat untouched, is maybe the better way to support biodiversity while also maximizing yields to feed people. Mm-hmm. That being said, And so that was actually the thing that was the question that was driving Jonathan's study. I just didn't sort of get into that. But the challenge with coffee, so I'll just say a motivator to grow sun coffee may be that you think you can get greater yields, and that may be true. The challenge is that for a lot of producers, they may not have access to the inputs like fertilizers and things that actually make sun coffee more productive. But also both bird friendly and shade coffee in general, particularly from regions like that are highly desirable, like the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, like those producers, they can choose they can charge a premium for their coffee because of the sort of flavor benefits and the general coffee drinkers like to drink shade coffee is I guess what I'll say. And so they can charge a premium. And so those are this sort of like dueling incentives, perception of how much yield you're going to get out of one system versus the price premium you can charge, and also like what access to resources that you have to make either system make more sense for you.
Mm-hmm. We have another question. What's more impactful when choosing a coffee? Organic, bird-friendly, or both?
So the both question, any bird, maybe I didn't mention it in this slide, but at all bird-friendly certified coffees are also organic. So you're not going to be able to get a bird-friendly coffee that isn't organic. I'm not super familiar with all of the requirements of organic for coffee. I know we have another expert on coffee and biodiversity on the call right now who could probably speak to this. But I don't believe that they have the same requirements for sort of like native habitat the way that bird-friendly coffee does. So I would say, it is a bit of a price premium, but buying bird-friendly is definitely, the way to go in terms of impacts on birds. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, your presentation has been so thorough. I don't have any other questions, folks. This is an opportunity to ask any other questions.
Oh, I just got to, first of all, the coffee person I was referring to just messaged me and said they don't. I agree with you. So I was correct about that. Thank you, Natalia. I got another direct question about our bird-friendly labels on the packages of the coffee. They should be. If they're bird-friendly certified and they're not labeled, they're missing out on the chance to charge you more money. Let's see if I can go back one. So that green label on the left is generally what the certification label should look like when you're looking for bird-friendly coffee. But again, if you go to this link on the bottom, there you can find places to buy bird-friendly. Okay, another question. Does the term Arabica refer to shade-grown coffee? If so, what level of shade-grown? Okay, Arabica refers to the type of coffee, and there are different varieties of coffee, and I believe certain types of coffee are specialty, like need shade, or at least do way better in shade. That may be true for Arabica, but I don't want to answer that question incorrectly. So it is very possible that Arabica is one of the shade specialty coffees. But again, like you could have shade that is one or two species of tree over your coffee plants, which are not going to provide the same sort of habitat for birds as a bird-friendly certified farm. And unfortunately, there's sort of no way to tell unless you visit the farm yourself of where along that spectrum of shade grown that a farm is without that certification. Shade grown is sort of like when things are labeled natural. It doesn't necessarily mean nothing, but it doesn't tell you a whole lot. Okay, another question I'm getting. Since coffee does not fix nitrates, the driver originally for bird friendly was to be sure that consumers had an opportunity to buy, quote, clean coffee, i.e. shade keeps the birds, no chemical inputs to keep the environment clean. Chasing yield is likely to lead to environmental degradation. Why buy sun coffee? Totally agree. Like yield, growing. First of all, within coffee specifically, there's not conclusive evidence that sun coffee does lead to greater yields. So in some places, shade coffee may actually return greater yields, especially under climate change as conditions for coffee become less ideal and there are more extreme fluctuations. With the sun coffee being incorporated now into the bird-friendly certification, there's that guarantee that a certain amount of uncultivated forest is set aside. So you're sort of benefiting birds elsewhere. I also don't know if that's really a big component of the producers who are part of the bird-friendly coffee program at this point. So I don't think there's necessarily a reason to buy sun coffee over shade coffee. If you can buy shade coffee and you can buy bird friendly, I think that's the way to go. What I will say is that like if demand is increasing, then producers are incentivized to meet that demand. And so we sort of need to figure out a way to balance those needs. And in some cases that may mean producing sun coffee. And so this is where like the effects from the landscape scale that both myself and Jonathan show, there's concerns that like if things get intensified, but then also forest isn't protected elsewhere, there's going to be potentially just intensification everywhere. So yeah, there's some definite chasing yields is definitely challenging, but we also live in a growing population and a population that's increasingly drinking coffee. So it's definitely a challenge.
I have a question here. Why is there less return when more than 25% of forest is on coffee farms is set aside?
Okay. I think we have people on the call from all over the place. I'll try to put it in the context of like Vermont and the Champlain Valley. I think about when I want to go birding, you can see certain forest specialists when you go into a highly forested block in the Green Mountain National Forest. There's forest, all around you. And if you were to take a drone, there's forest as far as the eye can see. That's going to be the place you're going to get forest specialists, but you're not going to get a lot of your other species that need maybe slightly more fragmentation, need a little more habitat diversity. So that's not to say that fragmentation is like good or bad, but the reason that you're getting these peaks is that when you're at that middle level of forest, you get the species that maybe, can use a forest gap or need more open habitat, but you're also getting some of the species that are starting to need more forested condition. So that's kind of why you're probably seeing the peaks there. And it's interesting that with functional diversity, it kind of mirrors what we're seeing with the species.
Mm-hmm.
I got a few others. Are there bird-friendly coffee farms in other countries in the world where coffee is grown? Yes. These results not applicable there. In Africa, there's a lot of different bird species that require more open habitats in various parts of Africa where coffee is grown. And so, yeah, I don't even want to speak to that because I'm not an expert in that, but there are bird-friendly coffee farms there. And I think research is increasing to address sort of how the requirements of the program are applied elsewhere. Let's see. What was the size of the buffer around each farm or landscape? That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. And then, yes, unfortunately, I did not visit these sites and survey them. I would have loved to, it's been a minute since I looked at the maps. And then finally, how do you determine whether a tree is being used, quote unquote, used by a bird species? Does it just have to be seen on the tree, or does it need to be actively foraging or used for nesting? How do you determine whether a tree is just a way to move through the landscape safely versus providing ecosystem functioning for a bird species? Okay, that's a great question. I think the question about is a bird that you see going to provide ecosystem functioning versus moving through the landscape, I think it's probably species specific in terms of how vagrant certain species are. And I believe that flyover species were eliminated from the counts, but basically you're right to, I think, critique, but we're just assuming that any bird interacting with the landscape is providing some sort of service, at least at that moment, and that that community is representative of sort of what the community looks like generally at any given time. But yeah, the bird could totally leave. They do fly. And then, and then in terms of a tree species being used, in the case of that study, they were looking at foraging. So a bird was considered to be using the tree if it was foraging. And so the study the study did not include nesting, which is a whole other thing and definitely a little bit more of a lift to survey. So yeah, I think that's all the questions I have.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Liza, for a wonderful presentation. I want to thank folks for partaking in this and participating. I want to remind you, if you're interested in joining Green Mountain Audubon, I just reposted on the chat the link to that. And I want to remind folks that Green Mountain Audubon sponsors a number of other events. We have the annual winter bird count coming up. And I know there's plenty of opportunities for folks to partake in that. In addition, if you look at greenmountainaudubon.org, you'll see some of the other events in December. Later in December, one of our programs is going to be on tracking avian malarial parasites in common loons. And so there's a number of other events coming up. So please be sure to check our events page. And Liza, I want to thank you very much for an excellent presentation, and hope everybody has a nice holiday.
Great.
So
Thanks for having me. Bye, everyone.
Right.